Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's session of the National Humanities Center webinar series, Humanities in Class. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President of Education at the Center. I'm currently joining you from my home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. My good colleague and really the mastermind behind our webinar series, Libby Taylor, is just down the road in Raleigh, and I'm extremely pleased to be joined tonight by Sung-Yoon Lee. Professor Lee at Tufts University is going to share his thoughts with us, his insights with us on the 5 myths of North Korea. Tonight's webinar, as many of you know, I recognize a lot of faces in the attendees room tonight. Tonight's webinar will be an audio and PowerPoint-led webinar experience. So you do not need to worry about video, you don't need to worry about sort of a heavy bandwidth. But you do need to worry about participating, and so the chat box, which is located at the bottom of the Go to Training control panel, gives you the ability to ask questions, to connect with others, to share your thoughts, to respond to some prompts that Professor Lee or myself might give. And my job as moderator is to keep an eye on that chat box and try to weave in your questions the best I can for Professor Lee and the talk that he's going to give us tonight. It's really important, though, that you register those thoughts, and if for some reason the conversation becomes pretty fast-moving and your question slips up the scroll bar, please don't hesitate to type it in a second time. And just to give yourself a chance to see how that works, I'd go to the chat box now, and you can type in a message. I would just greet the room, maybe share where you're from or what you teach. You may notice that there's a toggle bar that allows you to speak to the entire audience, in which case all of us will see your words. There's also, you have the ability to identify individuals that you can send private messages to. If you have any problems tonight, whether it's in hearing and technical kinds of things or questions about the webinar series in particular, you're more than welcome to private message Libby Taylor or myself, and we'll use this time in this space to help you out. The National Humanities Center is really tries hard, I think, to be that bridge between the scholarly world and the world of research and humanities scholarship and the world of teaching and learning and the world of the general public. We view it as our role to advance the humanities as powerful tools in understanding the world we live in. And we do that in a variety of ways, including an elite fellowship program in which university professors from around the country come and join us for a full year of research and writing. We also do it through our education programs, and it's really important to me and to us that we articulate those in clear ways so that they're the most relevant and valuable for teaching and learning in classrooms. One of the ways we do that is by providing a series of lessons and instructional materials online and for free. So if you haven't had a chance, please go at any point and check out the American Class Repository. You can access it through the link on the screen, but you can also go to the nationalhumanities.org main homepage and navigate through the education menu items, and you'll be able to find both those lessons, but also an up-to-minute and up-to-date list of our webinar series. These webinars have really been a powerful way to extend this conversation, and I think part of the currency of us knowing that it's a good thing to invest in is how many of you come out on a regular basis. And I'm very pleased to say that many of our webinars are sold out, including tonight's, and our capacity is generally right at limits. So if you ever have a chance to go through our upcoming webinars or go into our YouTube channel to view previous webinars, please take advantage of that. One thing I do want to note in terms of that schedule is a slight schedule change for an upcoming webinar. We'll be working with Andrew Huberek from University of Missouri on December the 14th. Scratch that, December 13th. We've needed to bump that back a day, so instead of Thursday night, learning about and talking about U.S. fiction and foreign policy and the way that literature and foreign policy in the 20th century mirrored each other. Instead, we're going to do it the night before. So if you signed up for that, please change your calendar, your iCal, and bump it back a day. If you haven't signed up for it, I think we have just a few more spots available. The other way that we really try hard to make sure that our materials are relevant and meaningful for teaching is through close work with our Teachers Advisory Council. This 14-person team who represent schools and school districts and disciplines all across the country has really been a powerful group in terms of helping us make sure that that connection, that bridge that I mentioned, is being built in the proper way. We'll be taking applications for next year's Teachers Advisory Council in the spring, and I'd encourage you that if you have an interest in serving both the center and humanities education and advocacy in general, that you apply for that. So tonight's webinar, once it's completed, will give you the ability to download your certificate of participation. Generally, when you finish, you'll see a screen pop up that asks you to complete a short survey, and then once you've done that, you'll be able to download that certificate. There are times that email is delayed for some reason, 45 minutes to an hour, so give it a little bit of patience. If it's not there by tomorrow morning, certainly reach out to Libby or myself. But maybe before you do that, even check your filter. Sometimes the school email addresses that you use have a pretty rigorous filter on them from email that has things like go to training in the address. So take a moment to go back and make sure that you found it there. And lastly and finally, I want to thank our co-partners tonight, Primary Source. I see Josh Craycraft is with us as well. Primary Source has been a really fantastic partner for the National Humanities Center. I feel like we're not only like-minded organizations, but we have a very good collegial relationship in terms of creating materials and hosting webinars like tonight's that advance these kinds of missionary goals. So Primary Source, please take a moment to go to their website. They're a leading nonprofit in global education. They do lots of great work, both virtual and face-to-face, and folks like Josh and Kara Roth, who I see is chiming in there as well, absolutely can be good advocates for what you do in your classroom. So the website is here on the screen, and I would highly encourage all of you to not only hear my endorsement, but go check it out for yourself, and you'll find that there's many ways that you can support your classroom through Primary Source materials. They're located in Boston. They've got a great office, a great staff, and it's definitely something that you that you should take advantage of. So that brings me to an introduction of tonight's talk, tonight's seminar. And at 6:25 p.m. East Coast time tonight, I did a Google search for North Korean news, and as you can imagine, there's a little over 56 million hits on Google. Clearly, this is a very compelling and very relevant topic. When I put together this webinar series last spring, in fact, it was really important to me to try to consider those topics and those themes that we could address from the National Humanities Center's perspective that were curricular, but also extracurricular. And what I mean by that is many of the webinars, including tonight's, probably hit somewhere in the things that you have to teach. There are curricular needs that and content that's going to be helpful when you finish tonight. But the truth is, all of your kids, no matter what you're teaching, are talking about North Korea right now, and they're concerned about it, and they're wondering about it, and they're hearing their parents talk about it, and they're seeing media reports and headlines on it. And some of these would be pretty frightening. Just take the screenshot that I did less than a half an hour ago. Latest North Korean ICBM capable of reaching U.S., so now what? Why this latest ballistic missile test is so worrisome in the Post. A war with North Korea would be hell, millions would die, CNN. These are really scary, Cold War-esque, reminding me of my late 70s, early 80s days when this was a really complex topic. And I think in terms of that extracurricular conversation, all of you have students every single day who are concerned about and who want to understand this topic better. Whether you're talking to them at lunch or in the hallway, whether you're talking to them before class or after, or maybe as a part of your curriculum, I think our goal tonight is to give you the kinds of insights and the kinds of background that just helps you navigate it a little bit more. And I would highly encourage you to really push on Professor Lee in the talk tonight to make sure that those questions that you have and that you get can be readily answered. So tonight's session, 5 Myths About North Korea, to me really feels to me like one of the more relevant ones that we've done in quite a while, and I'm anxious to hear how Professor Lee will help us unpack that. So in terms of introductions, I'm really going to sort of let the relevancy of this topic speak for itself. And so Yoon, I'm now going to unmute you, and unlike some other nights, I'm going to be operating the PowerPoint with Professor Lee. Professor Lee, are you there? Hello in Boston.
Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity to share with educators from all across the United States some of my recent gleanings on North Korea, as well as perhaps a couple of decades-old biases as well. So I'm very excited to share my views and try to address any questions and comments that anyone may have. Can you hear me?
We certainly can. Can you see that picture?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yes.
So the way, Professor Lee, the way we're going to do this tonight is, I'm going to sort of advance it when the time seems right, and I will watch the chat box and I'll feed you questions as they come in, and I'll do my best to sort of keep us on track for that. But here's the first slide, and I'm wondering how you might set this up.
Well, if we take a look at this picture, here we have Kim Jong-un, the North Korean dictator, who has yet to turn 34. He will next January. This photo was taken sometime in 2013, so a few years ago, when he was perhaps not even age 30. He's holding a cigarette in his right hand. Obviously, he's not properly dressed for the occasion, riding a ski lift. This was a luxury ski resort that was built purportedly with 300 million US dollars in 2012 and 2013. When you think of the phrase North Korea, I bet most of us at some point think of Kim Jong-un. One of the most natural images that come to our mind is the North Korean dictator. And of course, our image of the North Korean leader is not overly flattering. One might say patronizing. We tend to view him as oafish, cruel, funny, bizarre, backward. And the sum total of all of these condescending images that we tend to have of North Korea, which is a small dictatorship, a cruel dictatorship presiding over a small nation of about 25 million people, I think that kind of patronizing view extends to our underestimation of North Korean strategy, North Korea's strategic provocations, and its endgame, and our lingering tendency on the part of the US and its allies, that is, to underestimate North Korea. For example, assume that North Korea, by virtue of its backwardness and poverty and dependence on external aid, if we give them a bit of money, perhaps a large chunk of money, and are a bit nicer, maybe they'll take a step back or even listen to us. That kind of patronizing view we can find even to the earliest days of the Korean War, right after the war broke out, when Kim Il-sung, the founder of the North Korean state and the current leader's grandfather, engineered this massive systematic invasion across the 38th parallel, an invasion of South Korea in order to liberate, that is, communize the entire Korean Peninsula. And by the way, Kim Il-sung at that time in 1950 was in his 30s. He was still a young man. At that time, the Truman administration firmed up its resolve to take action. Why? Because the administration erroneously thought that the North Korean invasion was a prelude to a joint Soviet-Chinese global campaign of aggression. And if the US did not mete out some kind of penalty, if the US just stood by and issued rhetorical condemnation, then the Soviets would be further emboldened to challenge US interests all over the world, including in Western Europe. So not necessarily for the sake of saving South Korea itself, but for the sake of US credibility and in the context of enforcing the US doctrine of containment, the United States made up its mind to enter the war and to galvanize global support, international support at the UN Security Council, get other nations to support the US campaign to defend South Korea against the North Koreans. At the time, a high-ranking State Department official, a man called Mr. Barrett, Edward Barrett, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Policy, said of the relationship between Stalin and Kim Il-sung. Mr. Barrett said, the relationship between Stalin and Kim Il-sung is exactly the same as that between Walt Disney and Donald Duck. The point here is Kim Il-sung is not his own man. He is a puppet. He is Stalin's puppet and merely carrying out the orders of Stalin. Well, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the partial opening of the Soviet archives, we learned that the opposite was the truth, that Stalin was rather cautious, a reluctant supporter, as was Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader, and it was really Kim Il-sung's war. But the point, sorry to be a bit long-winded here, but the point that I'm trying to make is that our tendency to, if not belittle, outright belittle, then to underestimate the North Korean strategic mindset has not worked out in our interest.
That's a really fantastic point, and there's a couple of questions already backing up, but I think I want to start with this question. You framed it really well so far, and I think this picture actually does a great job of doing it as well, and that is what these myths are that we as Americans or over the last 50 to 60 years, 70 to 80 years, we've sort of let codify around this, and I'm wondering what our group would say. So let's take just a moment to pause, and I'm going to ask the group, the attendees, the participants tonight, what are some of the biggest myths you think of when you think about North Korea? What are some of those stereotypes or some of those beliefs that you have? And it doesn't have to be grounded in fact whatsoever. Or how do you see North Korea portrayed in the media that might do that? And Professor Lee, maybe we'll just pause for a minute and let folks type in their answers, and we'll see how they set this up for us tonight.
Great.
Jennifer says very poor country. Carly from Idaho, hey Carly, says very closed off, isolated. Josh chimes in, irrational, starving civilians. A throwback, Mary says. When we ask students about North Korea, they always talk about nuclear weapons, lack of food supply, negative image in the media, controlled by Kim, propaganda, isolated, less developed country. Boy, the myths are really just streaming in. How effective the personality cult of the leaders is among the people, which is a little ironic. Weak, possible, unstable leadership. U.S.'s greatest threat, Nicole says. Of course, we've got the hate U.S., Jennifer says. We've got the legacy of the Korean conflict, and Richard, of course, mentions that a childhood friend's father was killed there. Catherine's noting that this sort of posing normalcy, this pantomime of normalcy for tourists, use the education system to manipulate and access information, and of course it's on and on. So Professor Lee, I'm going to now forward to your 5 myths. I'm going to ask you to tell us more about it. But this gives you a sense of where America's classrooms are and teachers are in this.
These are all wonderful stereotypes, and I use that word intentionally not to disparage our tendency to come up with stereotypes, one-dimensional views of North Korea, but stereotypes are important. They are a gauge, an index through which we view other countries, other cultures, religions, nations, whose traditions we are not naturally embedded. And North Korea is so different from the Euro-American experience. We are children of the Enlightenment. We respect the rule of law. We believe in sovereignty and democracy and free speech and so on. But North Korea is very, very different. So different that I would like to say, although I would not want to make my Church of England primary school grammar teacher wins, North Korea is really uniquely unique. It is the most unique country in the world, and the unique characteristics of North Korean state and society that I would like to draw your attention to have policy implications. I would venture to say, following up that serious grammatical error with a bizarre statement, I would venture to say that Kim Jong-un is one of the most famous, one of the most widely recognized leaders in the world, perhaps in the top 5. One might even say top 3, only after President Trump and President Putin. I would venture to guess even that in the US and in many other countries of the world, Kim Jong-un is more widely recognized by name and face than the Chinese leader. And this is quite bizarre. It really is an anomaly in international affairs when you look at North Korea, a tiny part, 1/2 of a relatively small geographical arena called the Korean Peninsula, that is able to dictate to the biggest powers in the world, including the United States, China, Russia, Japan, and South Korea, the terms, the schedule of international negotiations. When North Korea summons, usually the big states listen and return to talks with North Korea. The current standoff is really a function of North Korea's reluctance to talk about nuclear weapons. North Korea keeps saying denuclearization, any negotiation on its nuclear weapons is off the table. North Korea also says the so-called freeze for freeze deal, that is the US and South Korea freezing, temporarily suspending their big-scale joint annual military exercises in return for North Korea's moratorium on missile tests and nuclear tests. North Korea says, we don't want that, we're not interested in that. But when North Korea says, okay, let's talk about everything, anything without preconditions, probably everyone will listen. So this is a very weird, a very unusual dynamic in world affairs, that you have this impoverished, backward, cruel dictatorship really being able to tell the big powers what to do, and also being able to wrest away from the biggest powers in the world over the past 20 years, by my very conservative estimation, over $20 billion worth of goods, concessions, including food, fuel, medicine, and a lot of cash, all in return for repeated lies of denuclearization. So North Korea is very clever, and let me come to my 5 points, 5 common misperceptions. These are all pretty straightforward, even truisms, I would say, although perhaps over the past decade or 20 years, it was not so apparent. First, the notion that if not for US bellicosity, or in North Korean parlance, US hostile policy, North Korea may disarm. Well, today, North Korea says never. Since 2012, North Korea has said we are never going to give up our nuclear weapons. But throughout the 1990s and for much of the 2000s, until 2005, North Korea insisted that it did not have a nuclear weapons program, which was, of course, a lie. And North Korea kept saying, if it isn't for US threats, US threat to preemptively strike North Korea, this US preparation for a full-scale invasion of North Korea, if not for US hostile policy, we would disarm, we would do this and that, which was a ruse. North Korea still says this. If not for President Trump's rhetorical bellicosity, his threat to totally destroy North Korea, his disparaging remarks about the so-called great leader and all that, if not for US belligerence, we would have peace. So this is North Korean propaganda that actually kind of resonates around the world because, again, we tend to view North Korea through the prism of, oh, a poor country, bizarre, backward country that is paranoid of the United States, the mightiest power in world history. So when the George W. Bush administration was waging war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the message, the North Korean message that the US is now gearing up to hit North Korea. Why? Because North Korea was mentioned together with Iraq and Iran as part of the axis of evil in President Bush's 2002 State of the Union address. a lot of people were sympathetic to the North Korean view and chose actually to believe the North Korean narrative, which was North Korea did not have nuclear weapons, and the Bush administration, of course, Mr. Bush, buttressed by hawks like the Vice President, Dick Cheney, and the Defense Secretary, Rumsfeld, and so on, were just intent on picking a fight, preparing for a war with North Korea. It's simply not true. And the reason is not because the US is the most moral power in the world or is not prone to waging war. It's because North Korea, unlike Iraq, unlike Syria today, unlike Afghanistan, has both the capability and the intention to shoot back and to wreak havoc on not only America's allies, principally South Korea and Japan, but of course today is able also to nuke, to destroy a major city in the United States. So North Korea has been able to deter the United States since the end of the Korean War in 1953, even without nuclear weapons, even before crossing the nuclear Rubicon, which was back in 2006, when North Korea conducted its first nuclear test on October 9th, 2006. And I'm going to mention a few dates, not to stress my educational background in South Korea, when, of course, rote memorization was everything. One had to memorize everything for no apparent reason, but because some of these dates actually have relevance. October 9th, 2006 just happened to be Columbus Day in the United States. October 9th is the eve of Party Founding Day, Communist Party Founding Day in North Korea, which is a major holiday. North Korea has shown a penchant, a propensity to resort to a major provocation on a major holiday, both theirs as well as America's, doing things on the 4th of July, conducting its second nuclear test on U.S. Memorial Day, May 25th, 2009, and so on, and also Chinese holidays as well. They like to stick it to the Chinese, their biggest patron. So the first common misperception, in my view, is really North Korean propaganda, and it's not entirely ineffective because I guess on a basic level, one likes to root for the underdog, but because the United States does come across as a bully in the eyes of the world. Not everyone sees it that way, but some countries harbor anti-US sentiment and a strong aversion to US dominance or imperialistic behavior. The second misperception is related to the first, the notion that North Korea merely reacts to what the US says or does. This is a patronizing view that extends to other cases. Americans are, may I say, diplomatically or very much undiplomatically, a bit solipsistic at times. Americans assume that other people just have to imitate US success. They just have to will it, and they too can become prosperous and powerful. Americans like to assume that if America gives a small client state or even an adversarial state a lot of money, arms, and financial support, the leaders will listen to us. Well, I think there are more exceptions than the norm, than the case where client states and small states actually do listen to the United States faithfully, receiving huge amounts of aid notwithstanding. North Korea does not merely react to external stimuli. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, shortly after North Korea's May 25th nuclear test in 2009, said, North Korea is like a child throwing a temper tantrum. The thing to do is to ignore it, otherwise we would spoil that child. I'm paraphrasing here. But while I understand the sentiment, North Korea does a lot more than just throw a temper tantrum without a strategic goal in mind. Again, these dates of North Korea's choosing when to do a nuclear test or major missile test or to attack South Korea. In 1969, for example, North Korean warplanes tagged and shot down a clunky US spy plane in international airspace in broad daylight on April 15th. 1969. This would be quite early in the Nixon administration. April 15th is simply the biggest national holiday in North Korea. It is the birthday of Kim Il-sung, the founder of the state. So this was a great provocation. Why? Because the shootdown led to the death of all 31 U.S. servicemen on board, and President Nixon was incensed. According to various declassified, formerly top secret documents, there was talk of nuclear attack against North Korea, bombing North Korea, bombing North Korean airfields, a naval blockade, even seizing North Korean commercial ships in the high seas. Well, none of that was done. And North Korea continued to kill, ambush and shoot and kill American patrolmen along the border with the South in 1969. So North Korea has a strategic goal, strategic mindset, a playbook, if you will, and actually, in my view, views itself, North Korea sees itself more as the party wielding the carrot and stick, and the United States and its allies as the asinine creature to be tamed. I know that sounds just bizarre, but when I look at the scorecard over the past decades, even before North Korea became nuclear, North Korea has been able to get away with murder. North Korea has been able to kill hundreds of South Korean soldiers, dozens of American soldiers, and at no point ever since the end of the Korean War has there been any kind of meaningful punishment. No lethal reaction, no military response, and no financial costs inflicted on North Korea either. So I think, in a way, that kind of extraordinary self-restraint has been very conducive, helpful, perhaps even necessary in terms of keeping the de facto peace in the Korean Peninsula. No war we have seen since 1953, whereas if you look at the 60-year period leading up to the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, you have 4 major wars enveloping the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, the fact that the U.S. has been very self-restrained, and I support that self-restraint historically and today and for the future, at the same time, I have to admit that we have conditioned North Korea to assume that it can do it again and walk away with impunity, even if North Korea were to conduct a major hydrogen bomb test in the Earth's atmosphere or in outer space, which would be a serious provocation, but it would probably entail no loss of human lives or destruction of property. If they loft a nuclear-tipped missile thousands of kilometers up into space, as they just showed us this week that they can do, then a nuclear explosion would have no radiation ramifications, no EMP damage to infrastructure. North Korea, I imagine, could walk away from that major provocation scot-free.
So, Professor Lee, I want to interrupt you briefly because, of course, again, this is a really provocative topic, and we've got a lot of questions coming in, and I'm going to do my best to keep my eye on all of them, and again, encourage you if your question scrolls out of you to feel free to repeat it. But I do want to ask you to clarify one thing. Teresa Kim, who's one of our Teachers Advisory Council members, she's in San Diego, and Lee Holder, actually, who's last year's TAC member here in North Carolina. Teresa has asked for you to clarify one thing. She says that she assumed that North Korea depends on China politically and economically. You mentioned just a moment ago that Korea likes to stick it to them, the Chinese. Did she hear this correct? Did we hear this incorrectly? And if not, can you please elaborate?
Thank you. This is a very relevant, even important point, that North Korea blatantly uses China, offends China, defies China, insults the top Chinese leaders, including Mao and Deng and Xi today, and is able to wrest away from the Chinese even more aid with each insult and provocation. It is very counterintuitive, but as we history teachers know, if we don't know history, then everything that happens in the now comes across a bit as sui generis, as unique. There's no real context to place current affairs under. Let me give you a couple of examples. Mao, in 1956, was very displeased, as was Khrushchev, that Kim Il-sung was purging, i.e. killing, pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese people within the North Korean Communist Party. So the two leaders did something naughty, quite patronizing, paternalistic, and imperialistic. They sent a joint punitive mission, that is, a Soviet rep and a Chinese representative, flew in together from Beijing into Pyongyang to reprimand the North Korean leader. This is blatant intervention in domestic affairs under international norms. And the Soviet delegate, or the Soviet representative, the head of the delegation, was a man called Anastas Mikoyan, Mikoyan, who was a major politician, member of the Politburo, and the Chinese representative was General Peng Dehuai, P-E-N-G, Peng, who was the Chinese commander in the Korean War. And the two men told Kim Il-sung to put a stop to this, release the political prisoners, don't kill them, and Kim Il-sung apologized and said he would just have those revisionists and these people that he deems as untrustworthy, have them go through some self-criticism and re-education, and they would be released. Well, after the foreign delegation left, a few months later, Kim Il-sung blithely proceeded to kill off, purge thousands of pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese people. And the next time that Kim Il-sung came into face-to-face meeting with Mao, which was in Moscow the next year in November of 1957, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Mao apologized to Kim Il-sung for his heavy-handed behavior, increased aid, and that was that. So Kim Il-sung learned a lesson. Very quickly, one more lesson which I think is amusing and quite telling. Now, a hereditary father-to-son succession in a communist system, of course, is a contradiction. Communism rails against such bloodline privileges, aristocracy, monarchy, but we've seen North Korea do it twice now, handing over of power from father to son in the wake of Kim Il-sung's death in 1994 and Kim Jong-il's death in 2011. So this became a thorny issue. The Kim father and son in the early 80s thought that they should at least visit Deng Xiaoping and seek his understanding. So Kim Il-sung first visited in September 1982 and buttered up Deng and said, "Oh, we so honor, respect your reform and opening program with Chinese characteristics. Can you please teach us?" And Deng was quite pleased to hear this and even formed a special committee within the Chinese Foreign Ministry for the transfer of knowledge and information to North Korea. And the next summer, Kim Jong-il rode the train, visited Deng Xiaoping in June 1983, and said the same thing and said, "I want to visit your hometown, Sichuan province, dear leader Deng, Chairman Deng," which was the hometown of Deng Xiaoping, so I can study this wonderful laboratory of gradual reform and opening. And by the way, can you help? Can you help us talk to the Americans? We want to open up a direct channel of communication with the Reagan administration. And Deng was really happy to hear that and Deng conveyed that message very, very happily to the Reagan administration numerous times, urging the Reagan administration to talk to the North Koreans, saying you can do business with them, these people are changing. And then Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger visited Beijing in September 28th, we're still in 1983, and Deng met with Weinberger, and Deng, lest North Koreans feel a bit marginalized by his meeting with the Defense Secretary, which was a big deal in those days in the early 80s, on the same day signed an agreement to give North Korea gratis, for free, Chinese, a bit outdated, but Chinese warplanes. This is in late September. The last time Deng Xiaoping told the Reagan administration to talk to the North Koreans took place on October 8th, 1983. And the very next day, on the 9th of October, 1983, a bomb went off at the Martyrs Mausoleum in Rangoon, Burma. The bomb was intended for the visiting South Korean president, Chun Doo-hwan, Mr. Chun. His motorcade was a bit late. The bomb went off prematurely, but all of the South Korean high-ranking delegation, including the foreign minister, deputy prime minister, and so on, were there, and they died. 17 South Korean officials died as a result of Kim Jong-il engineered act of international terrorism. The North Korean agents were, found, and they were arrested, and they confessed. So this was Kim Jong-il's doing, and Deng Xiaoping had lost face vis-a-vis the Americans. He was incensed. He said, as long as I live, that Kim Jong-il, and I won't go into the particulars of disparagement, that expression that Deng used, as long as I live, Kim Jong-il will never set his foot on Chinese soil again. And indeed, Kim Jong-il never visited China until Deng Xiaoping died. In fact, until 2000, 3 years after Deng Xiaoping died. What happened to the warplanes that Deng had promised to give North Korea for free? It was done. My point here is the Chinese act like adults. They grit their teeth, pull their nose, and increase aid to North Korea to placate North Korea, to not lose North Korea during the Cold War to the Soviets, with whom the Chinese had fraught relations throughout the late 50s and the entire decade of the 1960s and the 1970s. So North Korea has been spoiled, I would say, not only by the US and South Korea, but also by China and the former Soviet Union. So yes, North Korea sticks it to the Chinese today. Xi Jinping was incensed when North Korea conducted its third nuclear test, which was on February 12, 2013, right in the middle of Chinese Lunar New Year celebrations, the most important national holiday in China. Xi Jinping's first as the president, as the leader of China. So this was a direct insult at Xi, and he was very, very unhappy. And he told President Obama a lot of things like, I'm going to teach him a lesson. I'm going to teach Kim Jong-un a lesson. And President Obama was very pleasantly surprised to hear that and said that the Chinese are telling him things that they have never said before. And President Obama really wanted to believe that. But of course, what happened was, yes, there was a slap on the wrist by China, the closing down of a few North Korean bank accounts in China, temporary suspension of financial transactions between a designated North Korean bank, designated by the U.S. Treasury Department, North Korea's foreign trade bank, and the four biggest banks in China, Industrial Commercial Bank, Bank of China, Agriculture Bank, and Construction Bank, for a few months. But for the rest of the year, 2013, two-way trade figures between China and North Korea reached an all-time high of $6.5 billion. My point here is the more North Korea irks the Chinese, the more likely China is to compensate North Korea.
Wow, that's a pretty compelling argument you just put forth, and I think it's touching on or even directly addressing many of the questions that's coming up. And it's a tricky relationship that's hard to understand from a distance.
It is tricky, but when you think about it, North Korea is of some strategic value to China. At the same time, I believe if North Korea just disappeared, the Chinese would be okay to wave bye-bye to North Korea, but of course they don't want to go there, because playing that North Korea card against the United States, which is of course China's biggest long-term strategic competitor, is just fine for now.
Understood. It feels like you've gotten through the first two myths. How about the third one?
And I think for the sake of time, I think I'll try to be a bit more pithy, if I may.
Okay.
This notion that, oh, the military hardliners in North Korea are really ruining everything. The internationalists or the doves in the foreign ministry want to negotiate with the US. They want peace, but it's really these very rigid, inflexible military hardliners that have Kim Jong-un's ears or his father's ears. I believe, I can't prove this, I have to admit, but I believe that this is a dichotomy that is non-existent. It is the product of our own imagination because, these things, good cop, bad cop, of course, we're familiar with this kind of tension in any institution, in any government agency. And we are prone to applying our own tableau, our own contextual understanding of politics onto a system, a culture that is very, very different. So North Korea, and this is also true of the former Soviet Union, by the way, they liked to try to deceive the United States by cooking up this non-existent tension, dichotomy, this tension between the hardliners and the softliners. And Mao Zedong also did this as well, this conflict between Lin Biao, who was a war hero and the head of the Chinese People's Army in the 60s, who was a hardliner, and Zhou Enlai, who came across as a more cosmopolitan internationalist. I don't think this is particularly relevant, but we are so prone to trying to look for answers, understandings to North Korea's aberrant, very strange behavior that sometimes we are trapped by our own creative imagination. Number 4 is, I think, pretty much, end of story here. A lot of people wanted to believe, in the wake of Kim Jong-il's death in 2011, that Kim Jong-un, by virtue of having lived in Switzerland as a boy, may be a reformer. Kim Jong-il, his father, had never studied abroad. He was quite hermetic. He did not like to travel, and although he may have flown an aircraft with his father when he visited Indonesia when he was a young man, sometime in the 1970s, we know that he traveled only by train once he became the leader in 1994. He would take the train to Moscow to visit Putin, and also take the train to Beijing and so on. Whereas Kim Jong-un, he was exposed to the broader world, to Western cosmopolitanism. Therefore, like Deng Xiaoping, who had lived in France as a young man, maybe Kim Jong-un would follow in the footsteps of Deng Xiaoping and take his nation on a better path of reform and opening. Well, for every Deng Xiaoping, there is Bashar al-Assad, the current Syrian dictator who studied medicine. He's an eye doctor, ophthalmologist. He studied in England, but he's managed to kill hundreds of thousands of his own people. For every Deng Xiaoping, there's a Pol Pot who spent 4 years in his 20s in Paris, yet managed to kill perhaps as high as 1/3 of his own people in the late 1970s. Number 5, this is really a key point that I would like to stress, and let me return to this 5th point in a later slide, if I may. And may I proceed to the next slide, please? They say all politics is local. I would say this is quite true of international politics as well. International politics is not all about global affairs or global considerations. When you look at the basic internal dynamic in the Korean Peninsula, it's quite eye-popping. Nowhere in the world do you see such a huge income disparity, wealth gap between two neighboring states joined contiguously by land between North Korea and South Korea. According to CIA estimates, various government figures, South Korea is 40 times richer than North Korea. I'm pretty sure it's much more than that. And nowhere in the world do you see that kind of lopsided discrepancy. What does that mean? Well, the conventional indices for measuring state power, of course, are things like economic power, political power, what kind of attractive democracy, free society do you have? Are you a magnet to people from all over the world who come to you voluntarily in search of a better life and freedom and so on? There's something called soft power, of course, and then there is military power. North Korea fares not well, miserably in fact, against that other Korean state, and that would be South Korea, a global leader in shipping, in electronics, Samsung, LG. I'm sure many of our fellow teachers have a Samsung tablet or phone, smartphone or flat screen TV or an LG TV. These are all South Korean companies. South Korean soft power, even pop culture, is wildly popular across the Asia Pacific, not so much beyond East Asia, but it's a big deal. South Korean cosmetics, girl bands, groups, boy bands, films, TV dramas, South Korean clothes, even food. So South Korea is a rich country. It's a thriving democracy, and most ominously for the North, it is a magnet to North Korea's own people. More than 30,000 North Koreans have resettled in the South, and their story of coming across the fence has been very hard. And of course, it's not literally over the fence. Their path to freedom in South Korea is a tortuous journey through China and through Southeast Asia, involving a lot of shady characters, middlemen who extort money from these poor North Koreans. And once they come to the South, they are handicapped. I read somebody who pointed out that it's like a time warp. North Korea is so outdated, backward. It's almost like plucking somebody in the United States, shall we say, from the 50s or 60s and placing him or her in 2017. It's very hard to cope with the reality, with the lifestyle, with the competitive job market for North Koreans who make their way into South Korea. So my point here is the sheer existence of South Korea presents the Kim regime with a huge, perhaps even an insurmountable existential threat. President Trump gave a very strong speech to the South Korean National Assembly on his visit to South Korea earlier in November. And President Trump said that the sheer existence of a thriving South Korean republic threatens the very survival of the North Korean dictatorship. He got this right. You have a two-state formulation in the Korean Peninsula, each Korean state claiming to be the sole legitimate state representing the entire Korean people. And in this existential contest, I think it's clear to many of us who has won, the South, obviously. And then the question becomes, why is the continued existence of the North Korean state really necessary? So most Americans don't pay attention to this very basic internal dynamic. A lot of South Koreans don't either, as far as I can tell. But this is true, and it's relevant. Perhaps the most relevant reality as we try to analyze, assess North Korea's endgame. North Korea needs to be able to bully, isolate, emasculate, extort South Korea, censor South Korea. North Korea needs to dominate, prevail over, maybe even one day obliterate South Korea for sheer survival, because although North Korea seems to be doing just fine, the regime and its elites, that is, in terms of survival, in terms of getting away with so many criminal activities today, in the end, they live in perpetual fear of their own people in mass exodus, if they could, hopping over the fence to the south or knowing more about the freedom and the wealth in the south, rising up and challenging the government one day. There are no indications, there is no signal of an imminent uprising or even a public demonstration in North Korea, but it is something that could happen. It's within the realm of the possible. It's a recurring theme in history. And this, of course, compels the Kim regime to resort to extreme repression of the people, deprivation of the most basic freedoms. There is really no freedom of speech, assembly, freedom of the press, freedom to accrue private property and wealth. There is no even freedom of internal movement. To go from one town to the next town over, you need to apply for a travel permit 3 days ahead of time at least. So the kind of grinding poverty and extreme internal repression in North Korea is also unique in our day and age. North Korea is the only country that operates gulags in today's world, huge political prisoner concentration camps. I don't mean like jails, conventional jails, where some are incarcerated unjustly, but most have been accused of committing a heinous crime in America. They have been tried before a judge by a jury of their peers with legal representation and found guilty. In North Korea, political prisoners are people who say something like, oh, life sucks. My life is so hard. A neighbor rats on you, and then you end up with your entire family in a concentration camp. Political prisoners are people like the grandson or the great-granddaughter of somebody who had resettled in the north from Japan. By the way, Kim Jong-un's mother was born in Japan, although the Kim regime does not dwell on that fact. It could be somebody who was a landowner in South Korea before the division in 1945, division of the Korean Peninsula. So the extreme human rights violations by the state in North Korea, now 7 decades long repression, this is also a unique feature in world affairs. According to a major UN commissioned study of human rights in North Korea, published on February 17, 2014, the UN Commission of Inquiry report in human rights in North Korea alleges very persuasively that the regime at the highest level is guilty of multifaceted crimes against humanity, including the serious crime of knowingly causing prolonged starvation, and that the scale, the duration, the gravity of North Korea's human rights violations, quote, have no parallel in the contemporary world. So North Korea has an internal need to repress its people, keep the people in the dark, and to be a political factor by causing problems for the region, by increasing its threatening, menacing capability. And that leads me to the conclusion in this aspect, which is we cannot live with a nuclear North Korea. We can live with a nuclear China, we have, or a nuclear Pakistan and India, but North Korea is a different case because the stronger they become, the bigger their nuclear arsenal grows, North Korea will be more emboldened and pushed by these internal forces, internal dynamics of that region. North Korea will be more prone to taking risks and more prone to engaging the US and South Korea in a limited nuclear war. That sounds crazy, I understand, but when you think about it, who has more to lose? North Korea shows no regard for human life, the lives of their own people. If 10,000 North Koreans died in a limited war, if 100,000 North Koreans died, if 1,000,000 North Koreans died, the regime would still be impervious to that human tragedy. It would not be a debilitating political factor. For the United States, I don't think so. For South Korea, that has so much to lose, having grown so prosperous, I don't think so. The impulse to sue for an expedient political settlement could be there. I can't say that with certainty, but it is a reasonable assumption by North Korea to imagine the building of a communist nirvana through provoking and even engaging South Korea, if the US is still around, the US itself as well, in a limited war, and walk away from that risk with a better outcome than the perpetual inferiority that North Korea has to cope with today, the perpetual inferior Korean state that North Korea is today.
Professor Lee, would you like me to advance the slide?
I think it's time, yes. So I will be more pithy. The North Korean economy is a very complex topic, and I cannot possibly do it justice in the remaining time. But let me just say in a very superficial, brief way that North Korea is unique in terms of deceiving and keeping the outside world in the dark. Information blockade is not only directed at its own people. You know, there are no free periodicals, newspapers from the outside world in circulation in North Korea or the internet for the average North Korean people. But North Korea is also very good at keeping information on North Korea away from the outside world. Just to give you one example, North Korea is the only country since the dawn of the 20th century, shall we say, never to have published basic annual statistics like GDP, population, mortality, and so on. North Korea just doesn't do that. And it is very good at strategic deception. One could say that every nation engages in varying degrees in strategic deception, outright lies as well. But North Korea is very, very good. Give you just one example. On the eve of invading South Korea in June 1950, several days before that, a couple of weeks before that, in early June, North Korea suggested to the South meetings, high-level meetings, to talk about Korean reunification and the formation of a united government. And North Korea even came up with a timetable, a detailed schedule as to where to meet, when to meet, and so on. And South Koreans were mesmerized by this initiative, and then North Korea invaded and captured Seoul, the capital city, in 3 days. North Korea is poor, yes. The country is poor, the people are poor, possibly even uniquely cut off from the global economy, but North Korea has a palace economy, an economy that serves the regime elites, and the elites are not poor. Kim Jong-un is not poor. He has lots of money, with which he builds, among other things, nuclear weapons, with which he imports luxury goods, Mercedes-Benz sedans, and $7 million luxury yacht from the UK, tens of millions of dollars of expensive ski gondola and ski lifts and snow blowers and so on that went into the building of that luxury resort, the first slide. North Korea is also unique in that it engages in illicit activities like producing and selling drugs on the world market, opium, heroin, meth, and so on, as a matter of state policy. I'm not talking about gangs, criminal organizations. I'm talking about the state that does this. I'm talking about state-directed counterfeiting of U.S. $100 bills, which North Korea has been doing since the 1970s, and the Treasury Department came up with a moniker, a term for North Korean counterfeits, supernotes. Supernotes. Why? Because they are simply the best in the world. North Korean diplomats since the 1970s have been, more than 20 diplomats have been expelled from more than a dozen countries, including European countries, including Russia even, for blatantly, violating domestic laws. Like what? Well, like trafficking banned ivory, rhinoceros horns, buying bulks, cases, hundreds of cases of liquor, duty-free, and then selling them, dope dealing, and so forth. And these are officials that are told to do this to earn some cash. So North Korea's unconventional approach to diplomacy is also true. It is also to be found in North Korea's unconventional approach to economic policy. I also saw a mention by one of our listeners today that the people are uneducated or undereducated. It is true and also not true. That is, North Korea eradicated illiteracy before South Korea did. North Korea actually outperformed the South in terms of industrialization, economic output, until about the early 1970s. And North Korea today is one of the most literate countries in the world, close to 100% adult literacy. Of course, literacy is generally defined as the ability for a person of, say, age 16 and up to form and read basic sentences. But North Korea is a highly educated, literate society, and also North Korea is an industrialized economy. It is an urbanized economy. And this leads me to say, perhaps a bit prematurely, one of my most significant, most important messages. If you take away nothing from my presentation today, please take this, which is North Korea is the only country in world history to have attained the significant economic advantages of industrialization, urbanization, and near 100% literacy among the adult population, yet to suffer a famine. Let me say that again. North Korea is the only industrialized, urbanized, literate country to undergo a famine in world history, and will remain so, the only country. I strongly believe we will never see an industrialized, urbanized, literate country suffer a famine, ever. This was a man-made famine that killed over 10% of the population between 1994 and 1998, and this has implications. May I go on to the next slide, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
Or should we take a pause and take a question or two?
Well, we certainly have some questions. As you can imagine, they're starting to queue up here. And so, yeah, let's take just a moment or two. I've got two questions I'd like you to respond to. The first is from Lawrence Smith, who just chimed in with the second question. Lawrence asked a few moments ago that North Korea seems like a political, aspiring for political dinosaur status. How can they justify the regime in light of post-1989 history?
Well, they blame the U.S. for everything, for the miserable condition of the people, for the need to transform the entire nation to make the entire nation into a fortress with tens of thousands of underground military facilities. North Korea blames the US and America's lackey, flunky. North Koreans use these outdated real English words because they've not really updated their English dictionary. In any event, North Korea blames others for the misery of their own people and insists that the people are living in workers' paradise. So, keeping the people in the dark is, as George Orwell said, ignorance is strength. Strength, that is, for the North Korean state. And the fact that the regime is so paranoid that the people will learn about the underprivileged, the repressive conditions in their own country compared to South Korea and many other countries in the region, the regime lives in perpetual fear, I think, of perhaps a Ceausescu moment, the fate that befell the Romanian dictator when the people rose up and the military did not quell the uprising, leading to the execution of the Romanian dictator and his wife on Christmas Day, 1989. These are lessons for the Kim regime, and in fact, we know that Kim Jong-il talked about this, wrote about this, and said we have to ensure that something like this never happens in North Korea.
Another question that's come up is a question about the relationship between North Korea and Russia. Is that a similar dynamic as it seems to be with North Korea and China?
Russia has been sort of marginalized in regional affairs, in the affairs of Northeast Asia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at times, Putin has reasserted himself. For example, Putin received Kim Jong-il in August 2001. And the two men, Kim and Putin, came out with a joint statement on August 4th, 2001. And there are 8 paragraphs, and paragraph 8 says quite explicitly that the U.S. should withdraw its troops from South Korea immediately. And that's just giving support for the North Korean refrain. North Korea says all the time that the American imperialists should stop their colonial occupation of the South and withdraw their troops. And in 2014, in April 2014, Putin just unprompted announced to the world that Russia is forgiving North Korea of its Soviet-era debt. Russia does not expect to receive any of its debt, which was above 10 billion, except for maybe 1/10. And if North Korea pays that, Putin will reinvest it in North Korean educational infrastructure. That was basically a very discourteous message to President Obama, basically saying we can make things more complicated for you when it comes to North Korea policy. We can really take North Korea under our wings and make your life more difficult. But in reality, it's really China that has the leverage, real leverage over North Korea today.
Understood.
Yeah.
One next question, Professor Lee, and this actually comes from Josh, and in some ways this is the punchline of the entire webinar, possibly. Josh asks, what really should U.S. policy be going forward then, particularly if it's true that a nuclear North Korea will just keep pushing boundaries and testing limits?
May I just proceed through my next few slides, maybe spending 10 seconds per slide?
Sure.
And then we'll come to that main point. So this we can just skim through and then gloss over. When it comes to economic statistics, figures on North Korea, take it with a grain of salt. Nobody really knows for sure. And when you see like decimal points, that's usually a red flag. People are making things up because North Korea does not publish basic statistics. We use mirror statistics, trade figures of North Korea's partners, and a lot of this is guesswork. And this is what the CIA and the Korean intelligence agency said back in the early 1980s. But the main point here is North Korea became an industrialized country in the mid-1960s. So it was doing quite well in the mid-1960s, in 1965. May I go on to the next slide, please? And then North Korea became quite wasteful, and the inherent contradictions in the communist socialist system began to show cracks in the North Korean armor in the 1970s. Building underground facilities is much more difficult, much more expensive than building facilities above ground. And North Korea, due to the recession in 1973 and the oil crisis, North Korea began to default on all international loans and became credit unworthy. North Korea has the worst credit of a sovereign state in the world. North Korea has never paid any portion of its loan, either from a multinational financial institution or from another country. So what Putin said again in 2014 that, oh, don't worry about paying us back, he never expected to get a cent of that debt back from North Korea, and he said it anyway. So South Korea hosted the Summer Olympiad in 1988, and North Korea had to outdo South Korea, and it hosted what used to be a big-scale major international event among socialistic countries, the World Festival of Youths and Students, and poured in probably over $5 billion into cleaning up the showcase capital city, building what is still today the world's tallest uninhabited hollow structure. It looks like a giant pyramid, the Ryugyong Hotel. It has an uncanny resemblance to the government ministries in the fictional work by George Orwell, 1984. It's an ugly building, but North Korea, began to overextend itself on these fancy infrastructure, fancy buildings, and became quite cash-strapped in the early 1990s. And when the Soviet Union collapsed and Soviet subsidies dried up, North Korea's suffering led to its famine in part. But my point here with respect to the famine was North Korea had more than enough money with which to buy food and chose not to. May I move on to the next slide? The point here is even for a communist socialist system, North Korea, the state, has really waged an economic war against the consumer, against the people, and have tried to make the North Korean people totally dependent on the state for rations. North Korean currency has always been worthless, even within North Korea. North Korea spends the most on its military, its defense budget, as a share of the national income is by far the biggest in the world. Most nations spend about 1% or 2% of its GDP. The United States is unique. It has global military, strategic assets and interests. So it spends a lot, over 4%, and that's huge in consideration of the scale of the US economy. But North Korea, for a relatively small economy as it is, spending over 25 to 30% is obscene. No other country comes close to that. And also in terms of the number of men serving in the North Korean military at any given time, people between the age of 16 and 50, able-bodied men, at any time, about 20% of able-bodied men in North Korea are in the military for a minimum of 10 years. And that shows you the importance of military power to the Kim regime, but it also reflects the gross misallocation of human resources. And again, North Korea has been quite defiant and self-reliant when it comes to international finance. It has never paid back any portion of its debt. Next slide, please. So a little bit of commentary here. People used to think that it was bad weather, bad terrain, bad luck that caused the North Korean famine. But today there is just no doubt whatsoever. It was man-made and exacerbated by Kim Jong-il, who actually prohibited the delivery of international food aid to the remote region, the North Hamgyong province, which borders China along the Tumen River in northeastern part of North Korea. Why? Because every North Korean is born onto a political class. You have no choice in the matter. There are 51 subsets, but largely there are three classes, three categories: the loyal class, the top class, and then in the middle you have the so-called the wavering class, and then at the bottom the hostile class. So these insidious classifications have grueling lifelong implications. The state makes all the key decisions in life for you: where you live, where you go to school, what profession you can enter, and the fact that you had preponderantly people of the lowest class living in northeastern North Korea, they were cut off from the distribution of food aid until 1997. And as you see on this slide, the U.S. State Department assessment of North Korea's defense budget at the peak of the famine in 1997 was $7 billion. North Korea also spent $1.5 billion in 94 and 95 to buy outdated Soviet warplanes. North Korea spent $800 million in building an extravagant mausoleum for Kim Il-sung after he died in July 1994. Had North Korea spent just $100 million a year, or at most $200 million a year for 1994, 95, 96, 97, and 98. So had North Korea spent, let's say, $1 billion during the famine years, not a single North Korean man, woman, or child would have died, but North Korea chose not to. I put this map here just to underscore the point that North Korea's neighbors are huge. You have Russia and China. Japan, not so big in terms of its geographical size, but its economic weight and its political influence is quite formidable. And South Korea is much smaller than these countries, but it's the world's 12th largest, perhaps 12th or 13th largest economy. It's an attractive destination for many people. It's hosting the Winter Olympiad, as many of you know, in February. So North Korea is encircled, geographically speaking, by far more successful, prosperous, bigger countries, yet manages to sort of tell everyone what to do. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Many of you have seen this satellite nighttime photo. It's really sad. North Korea is virtually invisible, except for that dot in the north, in the middle, the western part of North Korea, which is Pyongyang, the capital city. And you see how brightly lit up South Korea is, Japan is, China is. Next slide, please. This is a bit wordy, but much of this is what I've repeated. Communist hereditary power succession, the first ever famine in an industrialized, literate peacetime country, military spending, most advanced totalitarian control of population ever, far more than Stalin or Mao. Historians on the opposite poles, both sides of the political spectrum, basically agree that North Korea is the most perfected totalitarian state in terms of the degree of control that the state has over its population. I mentioned internal travel. You need to have a travel permit for that. There are random inspections in the middle of the night, for example, just to check that you don't have an unauthorized visitor like an uncle or a nephew who doesn't have a travel permit and is spending the night there. So the state really goes to extremes to keep out an eye on basic private human behavior. The cult of personality is also much more advanced than that under Mao Zedong. Um, as the UN said, again, the 2014 Commission of Inquiry report on human rights violations. This is available on the web, freely available on the web. If you just Google UNCOI, Commission of Inquiry report on human rights, North Korea, you will be able to find the entire 372-page long document. But if you perhaps check out the section on the violation of the right to food and other related aspects of the right to life, pages 144 to 208, it's quite telling. It shows you the perverse priorities of the regime and how the state still today uses a policy of deliberate mass starvation to control the people. And the last line here is just my own musing. It's certainly debatable, but I think North Korea is perhaps the most influential regional actor. That is, when you take into consideration its economic status, which is quite small, its the size of its territory and the population, and soft power, of which there is really none. So despite these great disadvantages, North Korea is still very, very influential, and this is quite an aberration in world affairs. So the notion that North Korea, cannot buy food, that's why the people are hungry, is simply not true. The regime in 2012 spent $650 million, that would be $0.65 billion, with which to import luxury goods like Mercedes sedans, expensive hardware, and also things like, designer brand handbags and Rolex watches and expensive liquor. And it gets a bit silly. It sounds a little trivial to even be talking about cognac and these things, but these are instruments of statecraft for the Kim regime by giving men with access to big guns, by paying off, placating your generals and high-ranking party members by keeping them happy with these gifts. North Korea, and also in combination with fear, North Korea is able to maintain its cultish leadership. The notion that financial sanctions hurt more the people than the regime, it's certainly a debatable proposition, but I think most sanctions experts today take the view that North Korea financial sanctions are so focused, and financial sanctions in the post 9/11 era are so much smarter than the clunky one-dimensional trade sanctions of the Cold War era, that we do our best and we can almost ensure that any negative trickle-down effect, which inevitably there will be, is kept to a minimum, and that we are going after the regime elite's illicit activities and earnings from proliferation, money laundering, and so on. And I think it's time for me to wrap it up with some commentary on North Korea sanctions or lack thereof. Nuclear extortion, I mentioned holidays, Sundays, they do these things because they can pretty much capture the global headlines. What does that achieve? Well, it puts more pressure on Washington and its allies as journalists are competing to cover the story, knocking on the walls, the doors of the White House, State Department, and so on, asking, what is our response? that creates some kind of political pressure. And over the past 25 years, usually the response has been to, after a decent interval, a period of rhetorical condemnations, like this is unacceptable, it's serious provocation, a return to negotiations with even bigger concessions in tow. Next slide, please. So, what do we do? I don't think it's game over. The most recent North Korean intercontinental ballistic missile test now removed all doubt as to whether North Korea has the capability to hit Washington, D.C. The most recent test was like the two other ICBM tests in July this year, fired on a lofted trajectory, vertically, up into space. This one went up some 4,500 kilometers, and missile experts tell us, at minimum, you multiply that height, if you will, by 3, and you can estimate its range when it's fired at a normal trajectory, a normal angle. So you multiply 4,500 kilometers by 3, and it could be closer to 4 even. And what do you get? You get over 12,000 kilometers. What does that mean? Washington, D.C. is within range. Key West is within range. Every corner of continental United States is now within North Korea's missile range. So what do we do? A military response? No, because simply the risks are too high, and it would be a self-defeating policy for even the most bellicose, hawkish U.S. administration. And again, the fact that there has never been a military response, even in the face of egregious, lethal attacks by North Korea, is a testament to the very prudent calculation on the part of the U.S. It's not worth it. I think that dynamic still holds within the Trump administration. And of course, President Trump's unconventional approach to statecraft, belittling Kim Jong-un and making these threats through tweets and so forth, they do wonders for North Korea. They bring absolutely no benefit to the US itself, because they present North Korea with an excuse to blame the US for a provocation they would have done anyway at a time of their own choosing. So what do? We enforce sanctions. Sanctions enforcement is completely legitimate, legal under international law. It's non-military, non-lethal. The problem is, it's never been really done in a meaningful way. Many people have the misperception that US sanctions against North Korea have always been tough, or even perhaps maxed out. It's simply not true. Until 2014, all of 43 North Korean entities, which means both people and agencies, institutions, had been designated, blacklisted. Compare 43 North Korean designations to over 300 Iranian designations, over 800 Russian designations, over 160 Burmese, Cuban designations. Until 2016, the United States did not have a real tough North Korea sanctions legislation. Now there are 200 North Korean designations, a bit above 200, but still that's fewer than over 300 Iran designations, now 2 years or more after the nuclear deal with Iran. Syria, Iraq, Iran, Russia are more heavily designated than North Korea. And over the years, states that pose no direct security threat to the US, like Zimbabwe, like Congo, have been far more heavily sanctioned than North Korea. So this is quite puzzling. Why not North Korea? It's arguably the world's leader in counterfeiting, money laundering, proliferation. Why has our policy toward North Korea been so tepid? I think mostly out of self-deterrence. The fact that we tend to view North Korea through that prism of patronization, we think North Korea must be so brittle. If we push them a bit too far, they might just go berserk, lash out, and start a war, and we don't want to go there. I think On the contrary, North Korea is very clever. It is certainly not suicidal. It is rational, if you will, although its many strange actions like executing high-ranking officials with anti-aircraft artillery is completely crazy. But as a matter of its strategic policy, North Korea shows ruthless rationality. So we need, likewise, a long-term strategic playbook. Enforce sanctions. Sanctions enforcement takes time, a lot of effort. You can't just switch it on and expect results right away. It took the Obama administration at least 3 years of hard sanctions enforcement to get Iran back to the negotiating table. And what did Obama do? Well, the administration sent out U.S. Treasury and State Department officials all over the world to allied nations as well. To give you just one example in closing, BNP Paribas, the biggest bank in France, was found to be in willful violation of U.S. sanctions laws against Iran, as well as Congo and Cuba. So American officials fined BNP Paribas $9 billion, 8.9 billion with a B, boy, billion dollars. And the French president complained. Did the bank executives complain? No, they pleaded guilty, they said sorry, and happily paid the fine. Why? Because the alternative is far more gruesome, to be blocked out of the US dollar system. That's the death knell for a major business or a bank. Nothing on that scale has ever been tried. No fine of that magnitude has yet to be levied on big Chinese banks, which are some of the biggest in the world. Why? Again, out of self-deterrence. China might go berserk and start a trade war. No. Multinational financial organizations, big banks are very conservative, risk-averse. They will pay. $10 billion is a pittance. Nobody will want to pay that, of course, but that is a far more attractive option than being blocked out of the US dollar system. So it's time to enforce sanctions through secondary sanctions, which basically means going after not only the primary target, but also third country partners, which are primarily Chinese, as we know, in the case of North Korea. Will this lead? Yes.
I'm going to say, we're just about out of time, and I have to say that it's very tempting to sort of let this go on because it's such a powerfully relevant topic right now. But it feels like you've left us with not only plenty to think about, but some really strong conclusions that you've offered. And sometimes, when we offer these kinds of sessions, I find it a real benefit when scholars like yourself really mark a stand in this kind of content. So we appreciate that from you.
Thank you. May I just wrap it up in 15 seconds?
Yes, sir.
Will North Korea provoke if we enforce sanctions? Of course it will, but it will according to its own schedule anyway. It will not go berserk and start a war. Now, to what degree? Until when do we need to enforce sanctions? Until Kim Jong-un feels that the specter of regime collapse is a reality, until Kim Jong-un feels that his ability to pay off his generals is so diminished, they might rebel, and until Kim Jong-un feels clearly that his options are to live out the rest of his life in perpetual fear of assassination or rebellion, or give up his arms, give up his nukes, dismantle the gulags and live in peace with his neighbors, or he opts to abdicate and live out the rest of his life in posh exile in China. Does he deserve that? No, but I think it would be a small price to pay for the liberation of the long-suffering North Korean people and real peace in the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
Again, Professor Lee, thank you for your time tonight and your insights. And I would encourage all of our participants to not only go back and look at the recording of tonight's webinar and really spend some time untangling all that was shared, but in particular, please access the reading materials that are associated with tonight's webinar, as well as the PowerPoint itself. And each day we're going to be tackling these difficult topics with our kids, and we would encourage you to keep these excellent points in mind. So, Professor Lee, thank you again.
Thank you.
I do want to thank Josh Craycraft as well and Primary Source for co-sponsoring tonight's webinar. You can keep track of all the comings and goings at the National Humanities Center and Primary Source through our robust social media presences. And it's probably the easiest way to see what is coming next in terms of both virtual and face-to-face professional development. As I mentioned at the beginning, you will receive a pop-up in your browser that asks you to complete an evaluation. And once you've done that, you'll receive a link to download your certificate, usually within an hour or so. So keep an eye out for that. Our sites, our webinars are generally posted as recordings on our YouTube channel within 48 hours or so. So again, you can download that and access, and then maybe even share it with some of your students. I think if you were able to pick out the right bits and match it with the readings in the PowerPoint, it might be an interesting way to have your own students consider these very important conversations. Our next webinar is scheduled for December 7th, next week. We'll be working with Will Hitchcock from the University of Virginia on the price of liberation in World War II, with a particular focus on the battle at Normandy and Omaha Beach. Right now, we literally have just a few slots available. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to go to our website very quickly and sign up and register, because I have a feeling we're going to sell out quickly. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great day at school tomorrow, and we'll see you next time in our Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night.